And this is certainly something that's been going on for a while. Marvel absolutely sucks right now. They have really no ongoing series that I think that are really even great. There's a couple of decent ones. I still think Immortal Hulk's pretty good. I still think Ultimate Spider-Man's pretty good, but that's all that I can really come up with at the top of my head. And DC's coming on strong. We've got the Absolute Universe coming on out. All In has started. We've got new creative teams on a lot of the books. And DC has, without a doubt, the best ongoing series in the entire industry. Well, I'm sorry, in the big two. It's certainly not better than Conan, Transformers, or even Rook Exodus at this point. And here talking about this is Jim. The Marvel malaise goes on.
It does. And me and you have a show on your Patreon each and every week where we talk about the hot or not books. And in that, we try to read just about everything, and we can't. And we're trying to do it, forcing ourselves, and we can't because there's so many bad books. And like you said, even the ones that we would say are the best end up being books that you're on a curve now. It's more of like, well, it's not the greatest, but it's still pretty good. Or this one, it kind of is okay, but it's not as bad as this. It's a lot of that. It's a lot of, like the scales going back and forth of just trying to find things to read because people love comics, people love the big two, and people love Marvel, and the bigger characters themselves are just hurting. There's just not much to read.
And despite the utter lack of quality from Marvel, they've maintained their industry dominance. And by a lot of estimates that we have out there with the numbers that are available, it looks like they've taken a bigger chunk of the market than DC. Now, obviously, DC didn't have Absolute when that stuff came out, and I'm sure they're closing the gap. But even when they were bad, it seemed like nobody cared.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I mean, we sit there and what ends up happening with me is, I'll do a review of a book and I'll say, oh my God, it's so bad. I don't know who's reading this. And then these numbers come out and it just gives fuel to the people who hate me are like, what do you mean? It's number 6. I'm like, how could this be number 6 on the chart? Who's buying these things? And it is, I'm looking at the charts now and some of these books, it's just mind blowing. The idea that these things seem to still be selling. I don't get it. And with DC doing their Absolute and trying to do this All In, you should hope that they will, they'll have the gap, but they'll never overtake them. They seem to never be able to, which is very odd. But, there's some theories that we'll probably throw out there, but it's just, it's mind blowing. Some of these books that sell.
Well, I think one of the big problems with DC, and one thing that really hasn't affected Marvel, is Marvel never really starts and stops. They don't really reset everything. They don't have a crisis event, and we're starting over from scratch at this moment, including some of our history, but not all of it. And every year we have a new DC crisis, it seems, or maybe every several years, but now it's becoming a yearly thing. And it becomes harder and harder to really buy in and believe in DC Comics, even if their books are better, because within a matter of months, you can probably count it on your hands and toes that it's all going to be made irrelevant. And I think that has really killed any type of trust in DC long term.
Yeah. And DC doesn't understand the idea. Since the New 52, they do not want to reboot. They don't want to reboot. It's one of those things that they're trying to get away from, except that they do these resets. And then when people see that, they claim they're reboots. So when you go online and they say, oh, All In, people will say, oh, what? This is the 5th reboot they've done in 2 years and things like that. DC doesn't understand that rebranding or doing these new kind of things, it's not exciting people anymore. It's actually, like you said, it's making them think, well, why should I trust this? Why should I do this? And really, everybody still goes back, oh, they promised me this in Rebirth, which was really good. And then they screwed it up. And then since then, there's been 5 rebrandings and all these things going on. So they end up just giving up. They give up and just keep saying that.
Yeah, and you think about DC Rebirth, the last time DC outsold Marvel for an extended period of time wasn't as long as New 52, but it was a good period of time. People bought into that. They wanted the best versions of the DC heroes all in one universe at the same time. People were happy with it. They scrap it because, Dark Knight's metal ends up hitting. It's a different direction. Doomsday Clock starts lagging behind. Jeff Johns' focus ends up going on to movies. You get Heroes in Crisis. And next thing you know, it's not really Rebirth era anymore. And then you get Future State, which goes in, or I'm sorry, Yeah, it was Future State, which
Future
goes
State.
into Infinite Frontier. How is that not considered a reboot? You took us to the future and back to the present with new status quos, and then we get Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths, going off into Dawn of DC. How is that not a reboot? And now we're into All In after the entire world has changed with the introduction of the Absolute Universe and the cutting off on the multiverse. How is that not a reboot?
Yeah, and when you say that, the other thing involved there too is that there's been so many people who are the head of things. So many people that are, when Dan Didio, he gets fired, but then they still use his ideas. So it's always a watered down version of things. And it feels like a reboot. It always does to people. Now, again, technically, if you're like, well, it's not reboot if they're opening up this, but that doesn't matter. It's more of what people, like the court of, public opinion kind of deal where people will. If you end up having a video and you have that would say, hey, this new All In DC new initiative, there's so many people that jump in. I don't need another reboot. I bailed before. And these new reboots and things, or at least rebrandings, they don't have any sort of like what are they? They don't have a definitive thing like Rebirth had. Rebirth was an apology for doing the stuff in New 52. New 52 had that going. But now it's just they're calling it that. And it doesn't really do anything. And it's a shame.
And you have Jeff Johns front and center saying this is what Rebirth is, this is what it means to us, this is what we're promising that you will receive at this. And it is essentially our apology for New 52, which I'm sure hurt you because you are the world's biggest New 52 apologist.
I did like the New 52, but again, I tell everybody that's what got me into comics. And that there's another thing about it where number ones and things I'm sure we'll bring up. But the idea when you have these new initiatives and things, how can you even find what's new and what's going on? And like you said, Jeff Johns front and center. We apologize to the New 52. New 52, you had Dan Didio. You even had that DCYOU that was right before Rebirth. He comes out with a video and it was bad. But it's, hey, everyone had a slogan. That was story over continuity. And we're going to do this. And it doesn't matter, the continuity and people are getting, and it failed. But then Rebirth comes an apology for the New 52. But then when you go with like Dawn of DC, well, what's the phrase? What are you telling people that this is? It just ends up like,
Josh Williamson says, I really love superheroes.
Yeah. Superman will be front and center.
Writer,
okay. Man. Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing, too, is they end up going and talking. And it is that like stupid talk that, hey, this is my favorite character. You get that with everybody. Any character they're doing is their favorite. But I don't feel like right now, and I've said this on our podcast, I've said it on me and your podcast, the idea, what do you tell people? This is the new hot thing. And where do I say? There's not even a set point to go. It's bad. And again, like you said, though, to go back to the main thing about Marvel is you don't have that feeling, even though they do change things within books or whatever. It's not that whole thing that makes you feel like you've wasted time reading things for years. DC has that constantly. And a lot of people think that and they're just done with them. So that's the scary thing for DC.
And I think with Marvel, we talk a lot of times on how every number one, because they do like to reset to number ones and relaunch a lot without changing their continuity. Mm-hmm. Every time they do that is a jumping off point. And I truly do believe that the numbers do bear that out over time. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll get that bump on the number one issue, but the attrition and the drop off is just faster and you end up having to reboot or reset faster on those titles and relaunch them. But DC, with all the rebrandings and crises and everything, is the ultimate jumping off point. If you're fed up, or even if you liked it, you're like, why should I continue on if I like this next batch of stuff? It will never matter again. And I do think that has alienated a lot of people, and they're not even recognizing that DC, while it's not as good as Rebirth, I think you and I can both agree on that.
Yeah.
It's certainly much better than Marvel right now. Marvel doesn't have a series as good as Green Lantern.
No, Green Lantern's great. And again, that's going to go in the idea of what DC pushes too. They should really be pushing Jeremy Adams. I mean, himself pushing, they should nail him down exclusive. They should end up really pushing him as a writer, and then the books as well that he's on. And they don't seem to want to ever do that. I think that they don't want, him to get too big for his britches. Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think they want stars. They want the idea, when you end up we're football fans, the idea idea of, hey, I cheer for the laundry. The problem is, though, that at DC, like you said, this is the weird point with number ones and rebrandings. The rebranding makes people jump off, but you do have an idea. If you have a number one, you'll get a little bit back of the people who will join in because they know where to start. They do the worst of every world. They have a rebranding. They don't have a renumbering when things should be. I mean, I'm telling you, like when you're talking about Marvel and their number ones, I think of two things. One, I think back with Squirrel Girl that had like 3 number ones in the same year back in the day. But also right now, Moon Knight. They keep giving you these news. Hey, this is new. Same creative team, all that. And it's it waters it down. It ends up where you said it's a jumping off point. But if you have a rebranding and you have a new creative team and the story is not, maybe there's times you need a new number one so people understand that you have something fresh and new, like a Batman and Robin with Philip Kennedy Johnson. You're coming in after the stuff with Joshua Williamson. That could have used a number one where people, oh my God, because you see number one, then you see Philip Kennedy Johnson, who is another writer they should be pushing a little more. And you end up, oh, I'll get that. But they don't have that. They have nothing. People are confused. They don't know that there's anything.
It's not even associated with what was going on before.
Yeah, no. And you started an all in. So you have Green Arrow, another book that when you end up starting with Chris Condon should be a new number one. Things like that, Catwoman, all these things should have a jumping on point. Yeah, you're going to have a jumping off point. And if you do the number ones too much, and then you have the Marvel deal, but it doesn't seem to hurt them that much. I mean, and when we go through some of these sales and things like that, a lot of number ones in the top 50 and a lot of Marvel.
Certainly.
Yeah, and
even a lot of speculators, they come in for that first issue, the potential of a long-term financial investment, and then they dip right back out because they're not there to read the book.
Yeah, and again, and we've said it, I've heard Doc say it before, that's all that's for. Like that one issue, boom, we make all that money there, and then we'll see how it goes, and then we'll reboot again. That's a bad thing. But if you're starting something new and you're starting something fresh, and you have confidence in it, don't worry about the idea that a series was 13 issues before. Just forget about that because it had nothing to do with anything, and go in with some of these new number ones. I'm not saying everyone, but the idea of that's what got me into the New 52. I saw number ones. I love DC characters. Boom, I'm in. And they don't really have that, but it goes beyond that. I'm telling you, I'm looking at it doesn't make sense. It makes no sense. I think these books are selling.
I think another thing Marvel has going for it is that they aren't quite as old as DC. Mm-hmm. Well, most of the characters aren't. The big character DC, you got to go to the golden age. We're talking 80 years ago. If you want a nice full run, be ready to put out $1 million or more. And certainly with Superman or Batman into the multi-million dollars if you actually want to have like a full complete run. And certainly, everything with Batman, Superman, multiple titles and all that kind of stuff. Marvel, for the most part, most of those characters started in the 60s. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier to get a complete run. Certainly Marvel overtook DC in the 70s and 80s. And I do think a lot of people are just going in there and putting them into the long box to keep their run going, where it was going to be a lot harder for DC to do that. And certainly the people that are in our age bracket or even older, those Gen Xers that mm-hmm. have nice stable jobs and they've got that disposable income at this time, even with the way the economy is going, they're probably more emotionally invested in Marvel and have longer runs there. So they just kind of keep doing it. Whereas I know you and I are a little bit different because we came in later and I've always just been more of a DC guy.
Yeah, I'm more of a DC guy as well. And like you said, I talked to a bunch of people and, we just ended up the Zeb Wells run and of Spider-Man. So you have people, and there are people legitimately that say, I own all 60 issues. I've read 2. I just get them. And that's the weird thing. And Marvel fans, maybe it comes down to the idea that they are more loyal. Maybe the idea of not fully rebooting ends up, like you said, because people will, more so than DC, people at Marvel fans will say, I understand there's ups and downs. I get the full run, but it'll get better. It'll eventually get better. Now, that might not happen because of Nick Lowe and then things like that, but they seem to be more apt to maintaining their fandom, then even when they hate it, they'll still buy it. But it seems like DC fans, I just think that, like you said, the reboots have really been like a kick in the teeth to a lot of people. So they end up, that's when they just give up. And maybe they'll, some characters, but a lot of people I talk to are just, I'm a Marvel fan, and they're buying a lot of Marvel books. Now, again, they're older people, like you said, because they have the money, but they still are getting a ton of things. The DC stuff, it's more pick and choose now. And again, DC keeps desperately trying to make this right by changing things or branding it or putting a logo on the deal. They're even going with the old logo, trying to do that. And it's not working as well. It really isn't.
And it's disappointing because if you go over to Marvel, their entire X-Men franchise, despite only being a few months old, is trash. It's basically unreadable. Yep. There's nothing really going on with Spider-Man that's worth reading. Amazing Spider-Man's been awful. I don't know if you noticed this in the 8 Deaths of Spider-Man. They're doing the death issues. Remember how much you hated those?
Oh,
They're going back to that gimmick.
Hate it.
Spectacular Spider-Man is pretty awful. Right now, maybe the best Spider-Man comic book is Miles Morales by Cody Ziegler. That's how bad Spider-Man is right now. Yeah. The Avengers book is very mundane and boring. Nothing really going on there. I had to drop that one. Yep. I come back every few months to go check it out. And maybe of their big books, the one besides Incredible Hulk that's kind of good, I guess, in continuity, is Fantastic Four by Ryan North. And there are issues that I truly do enjoy. There's a lot of stuff on there that I think, find to be of poor quality as well.
And the weird thing about that Fantastic Four, me and you talk about it a lot on the show when it comes up, and it is hit or miss. But you do tend to still check it out, hoping that it's a hit. We're not Ryan North fans, but that's a book that people seem to go because maybe it is that book that, it's no fuss, no muss. We have these in and outs. It's like almost every issue feels like a new number one.
Yeah, if you don't like that story, the next issue
might be better. You don't like, unfortunately, you don't like Johnny Storm's mustache. You're stuck with that. He ends up making sweet love to a centipede, but it is one of those, again, when I talk to people, people will say Marvel their books aren't good. But they don't say Marvel itself. Most people are still just waiting and it'll get better. But DC, you do videos and people are just, they can't wait to just say, I hate DC. I hope they burn to the ground. And they've done that. It's not just awful people. It's they've done that to people. People feel offended by DC and what they've done. And like you said, right now they have a lot more stronger books than a lot of the stuff at Marvel, but yet Marvel outsells them. And still, I keep saying
Marvel puts out a ton more books.
They do, yeah.
All of them are awful. Their entire Star Wars line sucks.
Yeah.
They somehow screwed up Predator versus freaking Black Panther. How do you mess that book up?
How do you? Well, they did. And again, when we talk about this, the way that I could describe it to people is I had a Star Wars comics podcast that was doing fairly well. It was doing really good. I had to drop it. Like the idea that you're doing something, and Wes, when you're doing some things, maybe it's not your favorite thing, but if it's doing well, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to have to do more of this and I'll do this and try to make it fun for yourself, whatever. I couldn't take it anymore.
But you're a Star Wars fan. There's a passion there.
Yeah. And so I went even further, like over, almost 150 episodes, and I was gritting my teeth at points. And at one point, I just ended up, because then you have comments why you hate everything or whatever. I'm like, I just wanted to get better. I kept going, and I had to drop that. We have me and you talk about Marvel, DC, and indie books on our Hot or Not show in the Patreon. And when we're doing it, like, we want to talk about everything I said at the beginning, and we can't. You can't even bring yourself to read some of these things. I have a Marvel podcast and I'm struggling to get more than one book reviewed a week because they're so bad. And I don't want to, it gets to you. It's not like, hey, I want to do this and just rail into it. It does get to you after a while. You just don't want to talk about things you hate. There's nothing to love. And even the bigger ones seem to just be meandering and things like that. But I'm looking, these are the ones that sell great. And the X stuff, that's the worst part. You have Marvel fans who are loyal. They'll buy X-Men books, even if they hate them. Spider-Man, they'll keep buying. And instead of appreciating that, Marvel ends up taking advantage of it, but you see that it works for them. I'm looking at the numbers like, it's mind-blowing that people still support them, but they do.
Yeah, X-Men's still kind of in the beginning stages of the reboot. That stuff's going to be waning down very, very quick. And I do think we're going to see more and more DC stuff at the top, because I think Absolute Batman is here to stay. Obviously, Batman's going to be a mainstay in the top 10, even though you can tell the sales are declining on that. But we do have Jim Lee and Jeff Loeb coming back to there. Superman's doing okay. And I think Superman, was an ongoing book, is probably, by and large, if you take out the Absolute Power tie-ins, is a better book ongoing than anything Marvel's doing, outside of maybe Ultimate Spider-Man, which isn't even in continuity, so it doesn't count.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I agree. And there are, like you said, Green Lantern, I think, is better than any of them. I think it's better than Ultimate Spider-Man. People could end up, arguing whatnot, but I think it's one of the better books in comics. And another thing that I think that you kind of touched on a bit, but the idea where Marvel, you don't have as much of a history, you can buy some things. It's still long runs on some of these books. But I think
it's so much easier and cheaper. Because once you go past World War II, because of all the stuff that was going on during that time, where they were recycling everything and everything was conserved and kind of destroyed, those are very, very rare, very, very expensive to actually try and get your hands on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So you could get some stuff. But I think that we're back when Marvel first came out in the 60s. You did have that thing. Marvel was cooler. Marvel had the new heroes. I think that's kind of coming back a bit. I think that it feels like Marvel, while the books aren't great, the characters to me feel a little fresher. They feel a little more exciting than the same, because I think that people have run out of what to do with Batman, especially. And Batman's the big deal, obviously, at DC. They want to keep pushing Batman, but that's not as much anymore. And Chip Zdarsky, they're going back to Grant Morrison stuff. They're doing all this stuff. It doesn't feel fresh anymore. It doesn't feel like it is a must read, even with Spider-Man not being that as well. It just feels like, okay, here's the exciting company, and here's the one that's stuck in the past. And I think that DC still feels like they're stuck in the past a bit. And then with the reboots and stuff like that, it makes it even tough. It's tough, but they really, I keep saying in stuff, and All In especially, like, what is that catchphrase that you get, like a Yule Carter who has his comic shop? What does he do to get people to read DC? There's not a lot of things to say, like, oh, you got to read this, though they're still probably better than some of the Marvel stuff. But it seems just Marvel, I don't know what it is at the characters, but people love DC characters, and the writers, they're just as bad at both places. But I don't know. It's very odd. But yeah, you go. What else? I'm perplexed.
You and I both. And I do want to say thank you very much to Jim for joining me, filling in for Doc on the Doc Unfiltered podcast on Think Critical Patreon. As he mentioned earlier, we do a podcast on the Patreon, just Jim and I, where we talk about all the new comic books from Marvel and DC, and we do struggle through the Marvel stuff, but we cover all of it, all the stuff that we can. We certainly cover all the new big books from DC and the indie books, where you get a lot of the hot stuff. If you would like to check that out, there's a link to the Patreon in the video description. The Doc is Right tier includes the How to Not podcast, and Jim and I have a great time every single Thursday.